Hello. I hope everyone can hear me well. Okay, it's on. And the slides are on. Just a tiny check. Does it work? Yes, but okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. We're diving further into complicated topics, regulations. Well, the speaker just before, if you were here, already touched upon MiCA and DeFi and whether these two can get along. I will zoom on that specific matter. So can DeFi and MiCA get along? So as introduced, I'm Kleczewski. I'm a senior legal counsel in Switzerland. I have the pleasure over the last 2.5 years of advising only Web3 projects, specifically DeFi, very hands-on, and a lot of DAOs as well. And I'm in Switzerland, but I have an EU law background. I used to practice in Belgium. And when MiCA came out, one of the first questions was, will it impact Switzerland? And if so, how? All these structures I came up with, will they need to be changed because of MiCA? So the first step is to check, is MiCA actually referring to DeFi? And this was already mentioned before. There's one important quote in MiCA. It's recital 22, referring to crypto asset services that are provided in a fully decentralized manner without an intermediary. But what does that mean? And at first sight, it may seem that EU is maybe going even beyond what we've heard so far from the US, meaning the sufficient decentralization, where you don't require full disintermediation, you don't require full decentralization, you merely refer to what can reasonably be expected. Can we reasonably expect that it's like a centralized group, a managerial efforts or entrepreneurial efforts coming from a centralized group? So the problem with what we have in this recital is that both decentralization and disintermediation are extremely complex. These principles are apprehended differently depending on whether you have a legal background, a technical background, or you simply analyze it maybe from a sociological, organizational perspective. So everyone will come up with a different understanding, and it deserves further analysis. So if we were to still analyze these topics to have some clarity in MiCA, well, MiCA would still be in the workings and we would have no text whatsoever currently. And this problem was pointed out in the report that came out recently that's pinpointing the different remaining issues that still are unclear with MiCA. And as the report, so I've put the screenshot from an important paragraph states, is that we have a spectrum, like DeFi, fully decentralized DeFi, which projects can actually claim to be so. What are the side effects of that? Well, first, as we've seen recently, there were many failures in the CeFi space, and many projects tend to shift towards rather the DeFi paradigm, but they don't shift fully. So we have an entire spectrum between CeFi now and something that can be considered as 100% DeFi. So what about this entire spectrum? If only fully decentralized and fully disintermediated projects are out of scope of MiCA, what about them? So there's a whole legal uncertainty on the horizon for a big part of the market. Then MiCA is supposed to be refined with practice. We'll have all these national authorities specifying with guidelines. We'll have case law at the end of the day. Well, there could be potential discrepancies on this topic because jurisdictions have different approaches. They may be more restrictive, less restrictive, but also they may have different understandings. Let's imagine France, a country that already has some sort of WASP approval versus another jurisdiction that is not really out there and only published guidelines on tokens end of last year, for example, Belgium. They may not have the same approach and not have the same understanding of these very complex terminologies, like what is this intermediation? So on a side note, beyond this problem of the exemption, well, there is no reference to decentralization in MiFID and MiFID II, so the financial regulations that are in place at European level. And one of the questions that is still unsolved is, are tokens and these services financial services and financial instruments? And when are they crypto assets? And I've put a quote from MiCA. Well, they still have 18 months to come up with guidelines on that. So for the upcoming 18 months, it's unclear whether are you subject to MiCA or are you subject to MiFID? And if so, well, the problem of decentralization and disintermediation actually is not even a problem. You have bigger problems than that. Another important quote is that at the end of the day, Well, there's also an 18-month period for the Commission to come up with additional assessments on whether it's important to regulate DeFi and how. So 18 months once again. If I wrap up this context, we end up with DeFi being a principle that is normally out of scope of MiCA, but the definition of DeFi is unclear. The definition of what is a financial instrument versus a crypto asset on the MiCA is also unclear for now. The clarifications will come through assessments, guidelines, and practice. So you may have discrepancies, plus in the end, you have just stormy and deep uncertain waters for at least 18 months. And in practice, it may be way longer than that, because just having those guidelines, you'll still have practice afterwards. Plus, there may be comments on the guidelines, so we're still not there. So let's walk into the storm to better understand what exactly are we complaining about, because there's still like a bunch of people being extremely happy about MiCA because there are very good things in it. But what may be a problem for DeFi? So let's start with the light train, the things that may be a bit tricky, but are maybe not the worst. So if we look at the subject matter and scope of MiCA, well, we realize that it's all about a provider, an issuer, an offerer, so you need a natural legal person that's identified. They also refer to other undertakings, which would be all these entities that don't have a legal personality but could nevertheless be taken into account. And when we read that and we think about how complex DeFi setups are, it's not because they want to be shady or anything, but just because of regulations, constraints in terms of like how do we optimize the expense of setting up a new entity. You end up with one association, then a software development company, a DAO with or without a wrapper. You may have a foundation, you may have like a BVI, SPV for just the issuance of your token. So it's not always as straightforward as one entity handling the activity. How will this entire setup interact with MiCA? And this is maybe the first, let's say, light train part. Like you just stand there and need to assess your setup and think, okay, my token issuance company may need to double check whether they are subject to MiCA. The software development company, depending on whether they may be deemed to control the protocol somehow, the same. The DAO, well, as well, you need to check what exactly is the DAO in charge of. And is there an operational entity as well? So you need to reassess your entire setup and just identify the entities which may be subject to MiCA. It's not as easy as that. Then what exactly will be the consequences if one of these entities is subject to MiCA? If we deep dive into a very pragmatic approach, well, for example, in terms of marketing communications. Well, marketing in Web3 is quite particular. You don't use necessarily the same tools. I mean, CeFi may, but DeFi will not have huge banners on public transportation. You will never see that. It's more about branding at conferences, Discord, Twitter. You may have influencers. Well, marketing communications are supposed to be clearly identified as such. How will that work out on social media? Are you supposed to add a disclaimer under your tweet? Well, how does this work out in terms of how many characters you put in your tweet? These things will be specified over time in practice with guidelines, but for now, like, you may really ask yourself the question, if I am subject to it, what am I supposed to do? So marketing communications are supposed to include an email, but also a phone number. So let's think about it. You have a team of 10. You may have some community managers. Whose number? Who's going to answer that? If you have 1,000 users that all call at the same time and you have only 2 people handling the phone number, like, this does not seem to work with a DeFi setup when you look at how most teams are structured. It may perfectly well for CeFi with like big teams, everything is structured in a corporate manner, but for DeFi, maybe a bit complicated. Then the white paper shall be finished first before you even publish any marketing communications. So if you want to announce your token before you have finalized this very important white paper, well, you're not supposed to. But to what extent, what is considered a marketing communication? So there is some place here for interpretation that will need to be clarified over time. Like, can I announce that there will be a token coming soon, even if we don't have a white paper yet? What can I say about it exactly? Then in terms of the white paper, and I see there's a cat in an audience, so my cat in the slides may be a good thing for him. The white paper shall be published in the same version as the one that was notified to the local authorities. So if you want to do some last-minute adjustments, as it may often be the case in practice, well, too bad. If you have submitted it for approval, you need to stick to that version. As well, if there are any significant changes, mistakes, or inaccuracies, which could happen because these topics evolve over time. You may discover new things. You want to add them. Well, you need to first notify it at least 7 days before you publish the updated version. So let's imagine you have an intern that did a big mistake. No one spotted it. You need to correct it ASAP. Well, you first notify to the authorities, and then only you can update the white paper. I'm not quite sure how this will work out as well in practice. On paper, it may seem a good thing, but then it creates a sort of delay that may be tricky. And they also clarified that there's liability for the white paper. Currently, I think it's not clear maybe to everyone, but this white paper is potentially the only clear source of information about the token, the project, and so on. And one of the very good things about MiCA is that they clarify what should be in there. Currently, you have some white papers that are like light papers that are 5-10 pages long, others that are basically research papers that extend to 50 pages. How do you handle like these discrepancies? Sometimes you have all the information necessary, sometimes you only have part of it. So MiCA clarifies that and adds this layer of you are liable for what you put in there. If you state that this token is generating some sort of yield, well, you need to stick to it. And you can't just exclude or limit your civil liability for that. So these reminders are actually quite welcome, but maybe something that a lot of DeFi protocols don't want to handle because these are shaky grounds. Like some other speakers presented all the aspects relating to risk management, for example. The white paper is supposed to specify the risks, but this is still an ongoing research topic. All the risks are not clear. It's very complex. So what if you have omitted a risk that only stood out afterwards? Are you liable for this omission just because it was not clear based on the pre-existing research? There's also a right of withdrawal. There was a lot of talks about that like a year ago or something. Well, currently if you purchase tokens, well, you just stick with them. If you change your mind, it's too bad. Well, in line with the EU approach that you have for all the consumer goods, for example, which does not exactly exist in Switzerland, so here there's a big change. Well, you have a right of withdrawal. You purchase tokens, you don't like these tokens, you changed your mind, oh, it was a mistake. You have 14 days to change your mind. And the person is even supposed to reimburse to you any charges. So, as well, it's not exactly compatible with the approach that DeFi may have currently. But there are exceptions, and this is what everyone loves, and as a lawyer, this is the fun part as well, to have exceptions. And some of them are quite useful, so you could use the fact that it's less than 150 people that purchase these tokens from you, that it's less than 1 million, and then this is only just for the white paper. And then you even have some exceptions to be outside of those constraining guidelines, not guidelines, but provisions regarding marketing communications. You don't want to add a phone number? Well, you can just offer those tokens for free, airdrop, automatically create them as a reward in a proof of stake. Or, and that's actually quite important, if everything is already up and running and it's a utility token, that's also an exemption. So the solutions could be dropping tokens on a DEX to be further explored, to offer them at a very low price to be below the 1 million, just go all the way for airdrops. There's quite a lot of them recently. Maybe that's the way forward. Or maybe to launch the protocol first, have some sort of test tokens that you offer prior to the actual sale. So you can argue that it's a utility token that's already integrated with an existing protocol. But all of this are like potential solutions to be explored depending on the setup. So this is not legal advice. I'm still doing the disclaimer because it looks kind of like a legal advice now that I read it on the screen. But the question is, how do you assess whether you're exposed to those regulations anyway in the EU? Based on the IP address, do you block it? I mean, people just use VPNs, so there's a lot of questions there. I'm getting into the funder, and apparently I have 5 minutes left, so I'll go quickly through it and just mention these things. This is the worst part. So this was about the tokens, but you have this entire part of authorizations and operating conditions, and this is where it really gets tricky for DeFi protocols. So the pain point is that you can't offer your services if you are not authorized in the EU, and you need for that to have an entity in the EU. So the temporary solution is to rely on reverse solicitation, as it's done currently for a lot of protocols, most of them actually. But reverse solicitation has no proper interpretation for crypto currently. So people just rely on what is done in terms of financial regulations. But is it suited? There's no practice really extending on that. There was like one occurrence with the BaFin and the Hallo Deutschland Uniswap wallet. So that's one example. How will it evolve over time? Will it still be able to rely on reverse solicitation? That's unclear. And if we check what are the implications of the authorization, well, there's a pro. Once you're authorized, you can really practice everywhere, like provide your service everywhere in the EU. But there's still a few cons. Like you need to have effective management in the EU. Like how will this work out for unwrapped DAOs? You need like a wrapper, but who is the effective management? Does it mean that you need to have a specific committee within the DAO, like a multi-sig that doxes themselves and are put in this application? If you don't have a legal person, you need to display equivalent levels of protection, but how will this be assessed in practice? Like, how do you assess the requirements in terms of proper funding and insurance for a DAO? If you're not authorized, and maybe this is quite important, if you're not authorized as a provider in the EU, you're not supposed to present yourself as such. So if you have a lending protocol, are you still allowed to present yourself as a lending protocol or a DAX at an EU-based conference? Can people go to FCC after MiCA and say, hey, we're a lending protocol, even if you're not registered as one in the EU? And then you need to specify the services in the authorization. So if you want to upgrade your services and offer something new, well, you just can't launch the new product before you first explain it to the authorities. In the application, there's a long list of 19 actually types of information you need to provide. And if I go to the pros, well, at least you need to think about all these elements. You need to clarify it, be transparent, which is a good thing, because a lot of these elements are not necessarily clear currently. It can be obscure, like the governance. Often you need to really dig into the documentation to understand it. In terms of compliant handling, like how many DeFi protocols have a compliant handling procedure that is out there. So this may be good, and as it was pointed out in the report, sometimes people have the feeling that maybe those projects go far beyond the skills and the competence of the technical developers that put them forward. But the cons are, will the authorities actually be able to assess the information that they receive? Is this authority skilled enough to understand the complex risk assessment that was done by a protocol? How will they understand all the economic exploit possibilities, all the technical aspects of the smart contracts underpinning the protocol? So this might be quite tricky. And there's also outsourcing. There are so many protocols that are intertwined. And if it's considered as outsourcing, it means that you need an actual agreement specifying the rights and obligations. But when you check what's happening in the landscape, you mostly have handshake deals. Something that's on Telegram, like on Discord. Well, will this be enough? And then the bottom line, trying to be in time, hopefully it's the case. So the bottom line is that for the token issuance, it may be not such a big pain to have MiCA out there. It may even be a good thing if proactively you just decide to have a clear white paper, you don't necessarily register it. It may be more of a pain for the marketing communications, but then there's some leeway regarding the existing exemptions. So for token issuance, we're actually pretty good. But then when it comes to provision of crypto assets, because of this unclarity of whether does it apply to DeFi or not, well, it may be complicated. So it's good that there are these recommendations, because you need some professional diligence in those in the DeFi sphere for sure. But requesting the entity to register is just raising a lot of questions regarding which entity, is this entity really there? Like, does it require all DAOs to get a wrapper at the end? Or what about protocols being fully automated, where you literally throw away the private keys, or being decentralized? So it creates a lot of questions. So maybe DeFi should be subject to some, not even maybe, like certainly there should be some standards to ensure professional diligence and make sure that people know what they're doing. And it's not just great ideas, it's great ideas being correctly implemented. But the way it's done currently in MiCA maybe needs some tweaking, just to take into account how DeFi works and the different, let's say, peculiarities of the field compared to CeFi. Thank you very much for your attention. And then don't hesitate to reach out to me. block the other on Twitter or on Telegram, gladly discussing anything DeFi or DAO. Thank you. Any questions? I don't know if I need to take questions or one. If anyone has a question, it's now or never. There's one.
Okay, so I will ask just because DeFi is the place for the whole world, so maybe why the regulation is not made in a way that it's offering for those companies or users who want to come out from shady identity to public, because maybe they want to gain trust of the others. So I mean, the regulation should be done in a competitive way that the companies and users want to be regulated, to receive that trust, to receive that public money. And why the MiCA regulation is not doing the job in a way that is smart to be regulated. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Regulations are also there to create some feeling of trust, especially for the broader audience, like beyond the OGs, degens, or whatever. Like most people don't interact with those protocols simply because they don't understand them. They feel like it's unregulated, so really not touching it. And the regulations may help because if you have someone licensed, like a lot of CeFi providers, for example, in Switzerland, you may have Swissborg. They onboard people who would never touch crypto otherwise. So it's completely correct to say that these regulations may be helpful, and it's a pity if they are not done the right way. But at the EU level, it was pointed out that DeFi is evolving. It's still unclear, so it needs to be further investigated. And this is the problem there is that these are not things easy to grasp. And the regulator, if they want to do things correctly, needs to understand them first. So this was like the first thing I mentioned. If we needed to first investigate DeFi further, we would not even have MiCA yet. So there's like a trade-off. The only thing here I would say that is really a problem is that this intermediary period, those 18 months during which some things still need to be clarified, this is where issues may arise depending on how local authorities will actually decide to implement things, and it may create as well a lot of fear for protocols. That will be like just stressed out, oh, I need to comply with MiCA or not? Do I proactively comply? Do I need to shut down because of the regulatory risks? So this unclarity is just maybe slightly stiffening the ecosystem if people take it extremely seriously and really fear it. Otherwise, it can be an opportunity for innovation. Oh, there's MiCA, potentially I'm subject to it. How can I implement a few changes just to make sure that maybe proactively I'm at least partially compliant? So we will see over the next months how it goes, but clearly I'm looking forward to having some more clarity on DeFi, because for now, it's a bit tricky. Thank you for the question. Have a nice end of afternoon.